Hi, everyone. I am so excited today to be here with you with Rosemary Laoulach. Rosemary's book here is An Inquiry into Philosophical and Religious Issues, a practical resource for students and teachers. And before we dive into the conversation, I just want to say a little bit about Rosemary. She is both an educator and a counselor with her PhD from Notre Dame University, Australia, Sydney, and an MA in counseling. Rosemary has worked as an educator in international schools and universities for many years and counseling in private practice. She's lived and worked in Australia and Germany and the UK, and her work is interdisciplinary, drawing on philosophy, theology, and psychology. She's currently working at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney, and her publication here is what we are going to talk about today. Rosemary, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Of course. And before we dive into some questions that I had and that you present in the book, I want to ask you what inspired you to write this? It's a meaty tome, and I want to hear more about what it is that made you want to put this down on paper.
For many years, I taught religious education in schools, and then I moved on to the International Baccalaureate, which is a program that's taught in some of the international schools all over the world. And what I taught was theory of knowledge, and I really enjoyed it. And what was quite interesting over the course is run over 2 years, and it's done with the senior students. And really, the question in the course is, how do we know what we know? So students have to really think deeply and critically about that question. And we examine ways of knowing truth. How do we make claims on truth? And students really grapple with these questions. And we unpack science and the scientific method. How do we know certainty? Can we know certainty? And what area of knowledge is more certain than the other? Is this science more certain than religion? What is different with science and the arts, for example? What came to me over the time I was teaching it, and I still teach it for teachers all over the world. I do these online courses, is that when I started with those basic questions and led through students through the questions and came to unpacking some of the assumptions we have about knowledge and unpacking the scientific method, for example. So looking at the scientific method and how it works, through observations, we make conclusions and theories, but then looking at some of the limitations of the scientific method, some of the limitations of reason, and even some of the limitations of what we can know for certain. Then I found when I did it that way, and then I opened up religion as a way of knowing, students were a lot more receptive, because what they could see in their thinking process is that while science and inductive and deductive logic can bring us to a point of understanding the world, as many of the philosophers and philosophers of science have observed, that there are limitations in what we can know for certain. And that then leads an opening to religious knowledge, a religious faith. Mm. And then looking at religious faith, not so much as irrational, and religious faith is not so much, it doesn't fit in the scientific paradigm, but then we can explore what are some of the ways that we can understand religious faith. What are some of the ways of thinking or justification for religious faith? And I found students much more open when we would look at science and reasoning and then open up that question. So really, that's what really inspired me to write the book, because I thought there was a bit of a gap in what was written on this topic. And there's a lot written on sociology of religion, describing religion and philosophy. So in terms of content, so there's sociology. There are books written that have a more catechist approach, assuming students have certain faith on certain topics. But this book's different. I wanted to write a book that helps students unpack those questions, the big questions, and guide them through the process. So there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of summary of some of the big philosophers and religious thinkers, and then questions whether they can summarize what they learn, and then also questions to explore other thinkers for themselves. So I wanted it to be a book that helped students really be inquisitive on the big questions. And rather than be told what to think, um, be challenged to think about the question critically.
Brilliant. If I'm tracking with you, you wrote this to be accessible to students. I would imagine undergrad students, beginning graduate students, to have not so much a unified theory of knowledge, but a unified inquiry into the various branches of knowledge, things that we don't often think about as hanging out in the same sort of semantic universe. So, whether it's science or religion, how do we know what we know? And do we mean different things by knowing depending on the domain of knowledge?
Yes, a good point. Inquiry now in education, there's a lot of research to suggest that it really is a deeper way of learning and teaching and learning. Inquiry began with Aristotle, when Aristotle was known to say that knowledge begins with wonder. We
Mm,
wonder about things.
mm,
Yeah. And
mhm.
Socrates was well known to say the unexamined life is not worth living. So there's a rich tradition within philosophy of inquiry. And I
Brilliant.
tried to draw on that as much as possible in the book to guide the learning, because I think when you guide it through inquiry, then students can engage. It's really about them processing their thinking and you guiding the process as
Mm.
much as possible.
Yeah, what I love about your book is I feel like the experience of reading it would be a lot like being a student in one of your classrooms because you're not simply speaking at us as the readers. There are questions, there are prompts, there are opportunities for reflection on every page. And so, what I'd like to do with our time here is actually to go through some of the very questions that you pose in the book. And while the reader gets the opportunity to also surface what their answers to these questions are, I want you to share some of what your insights are, and of course, from the vast fields of knowledge and philosophers that you draw from. Are you ready, Rosemary, to dive in?
I don't know, I'll do my best.
Okay. We'll start with the doozy of a question that you mentioned, which is the opener. How do we know what we know?
Now, this is like a 2-year course that I've taught. But look, if we were to ask someone from an indigenous culture, how do they know? They know they would, and it's more of an intuitive way of knowing about the world.
Mhm.
But in the West, we generally would say that we know what we know through science, through empirical observations of the world, through scientific method, through studies, and particularly through reason. Deductive logic is really considered, particularly in the West, as being quite significant. But when we say that, that's actually quite complex. It's not so straightforward, because even the great philosophers such as Bertrand Russell would say that our intuition actually guides our reason, our understanding of the world.
Mm.
David Hume, a well known British philosopher, says that actually emotion directs our reasoning. So while reason might be a dominant way of knowing, and in the book, in the first chapter, I give some concrete exercises of logic and assumptions and claims, and students have to examine whether they're true or not, and some of the fallacies in logic. And of course, it's a very worthwhile endeavor. And I think we don't do enough of that in education, I think, in teaching critical thinking, because it's really important. But as an extension of that, I think that reason is also influenced. I think these philosophers are correct. There's intuition that guides our reasoning and also emotion.
Mm.
And I think that kind of opens up the opening towards, I think, religious knowledge or religious ways of knowing. And which moves, because as a lot of the existential phenomenologists have argued, that while science can give us a profound, very apt and in-depth view of the world and how it got here, and it's had a lot of discoveries over many years, science itself cannot explain everything. It definitely can't fully explain who we are as humans, fully. And a lot of the existentialists, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, all were very critical of science in reducing the depths of human experience. And
Mm.
I think we have to pay attention to them, because I think what they point to is something quite significant in terms of exploring who we are as people. And what does it mean to be human today? What are the questions that drive us that I don't think science really has had a grasp on?
Yeah, such a salient question. I feel like these days, a lot of us feel like there's a crisis of knowing, there's a crisis of knowledge, and how this question of how we know what we know. And I think we see this a lot about in our social turmoil, political turmoil, cultural turmoil. And
Yeah.
every one of us, no matter where we stand on any number of issues, think that these other people are just a bunch of idiots that aren't thinking clearly. And one subset of that knowledge is this idea of science. And science, the idea of science has become a cultural war issue. I saw this really show up with the advent of COVID, right? We had people who had a knee-jerk distrust of what they considered to be science. And that created entrenched people who said, trust the science as a mantra, as though it were a completely settled question. And we had this matter of applied science, really applied disaster epidemiology on the ground of what's going on with this mutating pandemic. Where does it come from? How can we solve it? And I think a lot of us recognize the rhetorical slipperiness of what science even is. But for some who were concerned about public good and safety, we really wanted there to be a science that was like enshrined and settled, and or at least open to the data as it emerged, but in a way that really advocated for the common good. And I feel like what you're suggesting here is that science has always been a way more slippery phenomenon, or at least pure reason has always been a more slippery phenomenon than what we might expect. And the decisions of when we mask, when we get vaccinated, who really is for it, who really is against it. So much of it has to do with our emotions, right? So much of it has to do with our inherited biases. And almost none of us are as logical or rational as we might like to believe in our modern Enlightenment world.
No, you're right. And there's a lot of philosophers of science who argue this. Thomas Kuhn is a well-known philosopher of science who talks about the influence of emotions that stop scientific progress because of the group's confirmation bias, but their emotional interest in particular scientific views. And that's why it takes a long time for changes in scientific paradigms,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
because of the emotions of scientists. We know that now, I think, for a long time in philosophy of science, that the scientific project is not one that's immutable or removed from intuition or confirmation bias. We know that it does exist in science.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember when Carl Sagan titled one of his books, The Demon Haunted World, triumphantly celebrating how science was going to move us away from the silly superstitions that so obsessed people for years and led to bigotry and witch hunts and all these things. And reality television shows about hunting down ghosts and exorcisms are more popular than ever. And there are people who might be looking at the latest findings from the Hubble telescope or what the Large Hadron Collider is doing, but also will read tarot cards and do work with a psychic to get in touch with their deceased ancestors. So we're going a little off script, but I am wondering how you might see all these things hanging out in parallel epistemological universes or not.
I don't want to dismiss science completely, because and I want to, we wouldn't have so many amazing discoveries that we've had and cures for things. And science can do heart transplants and cure all sorts of things. So I don't want to be dismissive of it. And in terms of technology, it's provided us with some efficient ways of working. But I think I find Martin Heidegger, a German philosopher, quite interesting on this, because what he says is this. He says that science and technology links them together, are great, they're useful. But he says when they become in control of us, that's when it becomes problematic. Now, he wrote in the 30s and 40s. Now, what he says is quite interesting, is that he makes a distinction between calculative thinking and meditative thinking. And what he says is that calculative thinking is what we use in science and research and logic and inductive and deductive logic. And it has its place. It has its place in research. But he says what we've forgotten is meditative thinking. Now,
Mm.
meditative thinking is what he says Aristotle and the ancient philosophers used as a way of thinking. And meditative thinking was that which is open to the inner self, that which has an existential component, that we understand who we are as people, that we're able to reflect on ourselves. And he says that this is really connected to the arts and particularly poetry, that that the arts help us to know who we are because it allows us to develop our meditative thinking. So these distinctions in thinking is really interesting. So what he says is that we think that calculative thinking, which is used in science, is the only way to think. And what we've forgotten is this meditative thinking, which has a really profound way of delivering kind of an existential way of knowing, which we've forgotten about. And I think
Mm.
that probably helps highlight some of the influences that science has had
Mhm.
and the hegemony. Says we think that science is the only way to think, or scientific thinking is the only way that we think about everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said there. And I don't want to dismiss science either. I feel like it is a love affair at its best with the world as it is, that is seeking to constantly be, refined by more and better data. And even though I grew up in what in the United States we might call the buckle of the Bible Belt, very a land very much driven by fundamentalist religious thinking, I also cut my teeth on the fairly science conversant science fiction novels of Isaac Asimov or the futuristic vision of Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek. And there, in my mind, there were always this like passionate, fervent, intuitive religious upbringing, but then this like promise of a scientific future where we can eradicate so many of the world's sufferings and problems. And I like to think that maybe the best of science and religion can help cancel out the worst in each other. And
But when they come together, it's wonderful. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So to get back on track with the questions in your book, I think this is a good segue. When you talk about these more existential ways of knowing, I'm wondering, can we know through wonder?
Yes. Look, as I said earlier, Aristotle thought that all knowledge began with wonder. He says we wonder about things in the world. We look at things and we say, I wonder how this happened, or I wonder how this happened. And he says that wonder drives our understanding of the world.
Hmm.
And so I think, and there is a lot of literature now in education that's starting to talk about wonder as leading the learning, because wonder creates curiosity about the world, it creates more questions about the world. And generally, I think it's the way kids look at the world. They wonder about lots of things.
Hmm.
And I think perhaps as adults, we've forgotten that sense of wonder about the world.
Yes. And is wonder a key potentially in the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Like, I'm wondering what is the difference that is between knowledge and wisdom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always ask the students this at the beginning of courses that I teach. And I think it's important because I think, in terms of understanding the difference, I think the ancient philosophers thought wisdom was the highest form of knowledge.
Hmm.
And they understood wisdom as being connected to the bigger picture. So understanding the bigger picture, but also connecting wisdom to virtue, a life of virtue. So I think what is really profound about these ancient philosophers is they connected wisdom or knowledge, the highest form of knowledge, to ethics and virtue. So living a life of virtue, which is really about developing your soul.
Hmm.
And so if we were to take that to today's understanding, obviously information, well, I often think of T.S. Eliot's words on this. He says that we live in a technological age where we've confused information with knowledge and knowledge with wisdom.
Hmm.
And I think, and with AI and all the explosion of information,
Hmm.
we have to wonder and ask the question, is all this information actually developing wisdom?
Hmm.
This broader view of things. And I think, look, there are many definitions of wisdom. We see it in the Bible, in sacred texts. It's mentioned many times. and philosophers talk about it as well. But my sense of it is it's looking at a bigger picture, the broader view.
Mm,
And I think it is connected to virtue and ethics. The ancient Greeks said that people can't be wise and be unethical.
mm.
So,
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, a metaphor is coming to mind as you're sharing, and it might be crude, it might not even work. But if information is like the feeding trough, the knowledge is when we begin to chew it, begin to internalize it. And wisdom is like
Yeah,
the digestion and the full metabolizing of something to where it becomes a part of us,
that's wonderfully said. That's, yeah, yeah, I like that.
potentially. Okay. In that, this is another cul-de-sac question, but I feel like you do address these themes in your book. When, when we talk about religious faith, of course, even that doesn't only mean one thing. And broadly speaking, there we could speak of a religious East and a religious West. And I feel like in contemporary times, at least, the public relations is that Eastern religion is more compatible, say, with scientific ways of knowing because it's less supernatural. So the story goes, it's more based on repeated experiences over time, such as meditation. Whereas
Yes.
Western religion, and again, it's a big misnomer because it's also like ancient Near Eastern religion, is more based on revelation. It's more based on things that are not replicable and you could say are more subjective. And we'll leave aside for a moment that's a way oversimplified version of history. And you have Buddhists have many orders of beings and deities and energies they interact with. And Christians have, and Jewish folks and Muslims have certain prayer forms that are very rigorous and do reliably lead to certain altered states of consciousness or peak experiences. But if we keep that dichotomy just for the sake of argument, what would you say is the role, or is there a role in things like revelation in your sort of expanded taxonomy of knowledge?
Wow. Okay. Yes. So if we were to look at the question, what is the kind of justification for religious faith? Now, in the
Yeah.
book, I go into a lot of detail about the cosmological, ontological arguments and some of the traditional arguments by design. And then I explore some of the contemporary thinkers, Platinger or who's the other person that, Swinburne, who's an Oxford professor, who talks about, he's quite interesting. He says that we can still prove the existence of God by looking at the inductive method.
Mm,
So he talks about it from an inductive point of view. And Platinger is similar. He uses logic and reason to defend the existence of God.
mhm.
And that's including some of the traditional arguments. But getting back to your question, wow. So revelation. In in the monotheistic religions, we know that the God is understood as both transcendent, beyond the material world, and immanent, which is within me, within the person. So the immanent is understood as that subjective experience of the divine, whereas the transcendent is something beyond.
Yeah.
Now, philosophers of religion have looked at this in many ways. So if we were to look at it, some of the contemporary arguments using inductive deductive logic, but then the other arguments, some of the existential philosophers, I'm going to mention Kierkegaard, who's another existentialist, talks about this leap of faith. So going beyond the known, the bounds of reason to something more. Kierkegaard was well known for talking about that, the leap of faith. So if we were to talk about his ideas about this idea of leap of faith, which goes beyond the bounds of knowledge or limitations of reasoning, then revelation has a role there
Mm,
because revelation shows me things that may not be empirically tested or verifiable, but I have faith in this revelation. And these the revelation stories that we know in sacred texts really, more importantly, is they serve an existential need, right? If we look at the Christian story, the idea of suffering and resurrection is really a story that humans have connected with for a long time because it connects to the human story, our own stories of suffering, our own stories of resurrection. So I think the existential element in Revelation or all the sacred stories really, from my understanding, is they capture our own needs and subjective experiences. And that's why we relate to them, because we also experience suffering and we also can move through suffering. That makes sense.
It does make sense. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that would be a sort of, yes, an existentialist, but also a pragmatist or utilitarian look at religion. Let's see what benefit it has, what practical benefit it has to speak to our living conditions. Which,
that's another justification. Of course, there are many justifications, but that's a very strong justification. And we know research now into religion and people who are religious. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that people who are religious are actually happier than people who aren't.
mm-hmm.
And there are various factors for that, but that's quite interesting.
It is quite interesting. And I wonder if, those surveys will begin taking into account the mass exodus of people from, I would say, certainly from Europe and America. And I really think in some ways Australia did this even earlier, from organized religion, people who are leaving it behind, many of whom claim a traumatic relationship with
Yes,
religion.
you're right.
And it is so interesting. There are lots of different metrics, of course, of happiness, what it means. But it's such an interesting question.
Yes, and I think you're right. So some of the metrics that I've read is that the reason for that is the sense of community, sense of meaning. So there's been some of the literature that I've read is around that. So the happiness is related to community and related to sense of meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the fundamentalism that I was raised in, folks would say they'd probably affirm those things. Of course, having a personal relationship with God through Jesus brings us greater happiness and meaning and answers our deep longings and questions. But revelation, they would argue, is revelation. It either is or isn't truth. And what we're ultimately concerned of isn't the truth. And I think that's where it ends up really clashing with scientific stories of reality and the way reality works. You say, hey, what we're ideally aiming for is something that's real, whether you believe in it or not, and that's like a capital R overarching reality that often has religion feeling sidelined in the conversation, especially, like you say, monotheistic religions, any religion that does rely on this idea of a transcendent revelation that in times past, at least for missionary faiths like Christianity and Islam, there was a time where you could have lived and died and everyone you knew trusted in that same revelation and thought it was as true as what would later be discovered as gravity. And so I think that gets to one of the questions you answer, or at least ask and inquire into in your book, which is, do religious traditions point to the same or different reality?
Look, I think some argue that it's similar reality, but I would tend to think that it's really about the cultures. I think different cultures understand the transcendent in different ways, whether it's the Christian Western culture, the Islamic culture, the Muslim culture. I think a culture and does have a lot that reflects in the understanding of the divine or the transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think that's my answer to that one.
Yeah, understood. So given that, so you're not super sympathetic with a perennialist argument that they're all roads that lead to the same path, that they're all ultimately.
I think there are similarities between them, obviously, but I think that there are definitely similarities because, as we know, the monotheistic religions draw on each other. So we had, Judaism, which was really Christianity drew from that, and then Islam. So there is a very obvious link between the religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also, I think, culture also. We just look at today's culture and how Christianity, for example, is reflected differently than it was many years ago. So our understanding of the world changes, and therefore our understanding of the transcendent changes as well. Mm-hmm. While there are some aspects to it that are similar, I think culture does play a part. And I think it should, because as we develop in our language, as we develop in our understanding of the world, our understanding of the transcendent also changes. Maybe it changes in wording or language, but I think it's inevitable that the descriptions are different, perhaps, to some extent.
Yeah, it makes sense. Even if one was a hardline believer that believed in divine revelation pouring down from above, surely the vessels that it's being poured in change over time,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
perhaps,
But the language, yes,
yeah.
yes, you're right. And the language of describing a certain revelation is different to perhaps it was
Mhm,
many years ago. So even if it's just around language and how we describe certain experiences, which is different to
mhm.
how people will describe experiences of the divine. Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps it's a coevolution. Perhaps, yeah, the very mechanisms and senses of ways of perceiving themselves evolve over
Yes.
time, not just biologically, but culturally.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
could even the greatest of mystics of 500 or 1,000 years ago imagined the internet and the
Yes.
ways that we have very concretely connected and interconnected our lives for good and for ill.
Yes.
And I feel like for a lot of the folks who are tuning into this dialogue, they're very engaged in these questions of ultimate concern and ultimate meaning, but they're also really wondering how it impacts our lives on the ground, given that a lot of us live in different moral reasoning universes, different epistemological universes. And we're all touching different parts of the same elephant, maybe, but we're also vehemently arguing about them. Curious, what would you say an inquiry based approach would be to the criteria that we apply to judging moral action? And how do we end up living an ethical life?
When I've taught ethics, my students generally are moral relativist, I find in my experience. Oh, miss, I don't know. Depends on the person, it depends on the situation. And
Mhm,
in the chapter of the book, I quote Russell, who says that while it might be hard to have, universals or something, but there's got to be more to morals than I just don't like it or I don't like cruelty. I think it's complex. And we know that there are the utilitarians and the deontological groups, ways of understanding ethics, and it's a huge topic. But we also know there are problems in relativism. The argument based on relativism that there is no truth because we can't all agree, therefore, there's no objective moral standards because we're so different with different cultures and different people. There's no objective moral standards. And that's connected to postmodernism, where the idea that there is no absolute truth
mhm.
because it's so diverse in perspective. And of course, perspectives do exist. But I think there's a problem with that because even to refer to truth means it's a circular argument, means that there is some truth because you're actually having that conversation around truth in deciphering whether your statement is correct or not. Many philosophers have discredited the relativistic argument as holding up philosophically.
Hmm.
I think it can lend to a kind of nihilism in the West. I think it has. And there's some who argue that this approach or way of thinking about ethics is quite a lazy thinking because, I don't know, it's relative. It's things are right and wrong depending on the culture or the person. So let's not engage in some of these ethical, moral issues. Look, I think there are many reference points to ethics. If you were religious, you would draw from religious ethics. And if you were not religious, there are many philosophical approaches to ethics. So I think it's complex. It is complex, but I don't I'm not a relativist. I think there's a lot of problems in relativism, ethical
Mhm,
relativism.
mhm,
And I do think that if we look, say, for example, there are standards that we do uphold. So we have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which suggests that we've all signed up to it, ideally.
yeah.
Nations have signed up to it. So it would suggest that there are some things that we all agree on when it comes to moral and ethical issues.
Yeah, I do find it really interesting the way that postmodernism has been boiled down in the popular parlance to being like, oh, it's all relative and we can't possibly agree when I feel like in its roots, postmodernity, postmodernist arguments are similar to Marxist arguments in that they are wanting to look at who holds the power. And it's the actual golden rule is they who have the gold make the rules. And we often see this in matters of conflict, right? Where, yes, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but who gets to break those with impunity and don't actually get censured because some of their allies are on the Security Council? and who
Yes.
gets slapped down as a terrorist or a rogue state actor who is set up for a coup. It might be
Yes.
nihilist to say that it's the ones who are currently aligned with the powers that be that get to do what they do and oppress and kill and wipe out people as they wish. But sometimes a view of history does seem to validate that having really high and beautiful ideals don't necessarily stop bad actors from acting unless there's a
Right.
critical mass of people who are genuinely holding those ideals out in the streets and are absolutely exerting their will, which is also a kind of power to make change.
Yes. Yes. Interesting point. But you're right. But I think we still have to have those ideals.
Oh, I agree. I agree. I think that we do. I think that, yeah, it's just interesting how ideas get diluted. And I feel like the post-modernity idea that postmodernists don't care about anything, it's, yeah, they deeply care. They might actually, at the end of the day,
Yes.
say, we can't possibly know anything. And I'm sympathetic with
Yes.
your critique of that and think, yeah, but we do have these enduring ideals that often are transcultural and transhistorical, even though there are also very embedded historical mores that change and shift over time. For instance, are most people's current embrace of queer folks as being beautiful people in theistic language who are blessed and loved by God and empowered by service. And it's mind blowing to think that the way we think that we until recently thought about queer folks in a lot of religious communities are the same ways that people thought about left handed people. And like there are these whole categories. And that's where I love science because and critical thinking because it says, wait a minute, can we just think about this for a second? And
Yes.
hopefully
Yes.
reason and revelation can kiss.
Yes. Good point.
Yeah. And in any case, Rosemary, I feel like you elucidate these questions and dilemmas really beautifully in your book, An Inquiry into Philosophical and Religious Issues, a practical resource for students and teachers. I recommend anybody who has been engaged by our dialogue today will check it out.
It's
Yeah,
been a
absolutely.
pleasure, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.